So no one's talked about this for quite some time, and it's because it doesn't really matter at this point. All the decisions for Injustice 2 have been made. We're looking forward to MK11 now rather than backwards to Injustice 2, but I still want to talk about this because it's relevant to NetherRealm. Injustice 2 had a lot of gear that was removed from the final version of the game, specifically with the female characters, and Dynasty released a video like 6 months ago where he talked about this, and I remember watching that video and I didn't really get his point. People in the comment section talking about how different pieces of gear were censored and how silly it was and all of this stuff, as if NetherRealm is protecting us from explicit content, but that's not true. And I'm going to explain why in this video. For people unaware, a senior character artist at NetherRealm used to have I believe it was an Instagram profile, and I believe he's made it private now to prevent this information leaking, but he would post old pictures of gear that no longer is in the game. Gear that didn't make it into the beta, gear that didn't make it into the game, and a bunch of concept art and stuff like that. And some pieces of gear were removed from the game were things like this. This doesn't really make sense for Black Canary's character, and that's why it was removed for the game. And the artist even goes to admit that that's the reason it was removed for the game, but he just didn't agree with that reason. The reason for the gear being removed from the game is obviously quite apparent to anybody who's familiar with the Black Canary character. This is just something she would never wear. It doesn't make sense. And I'm pretty confidently able to say that that's the reason the game was removed from the game, rather than some type of censorship. Because if we look at other characters in the game, they have quite revealing clothing, especially when it comes to the female roster, of course. But it makes sense for those individual characters. A character like Enchantress, it makes sense, because in all honesty, clothing for her might seem quite strange, because she's an ancient character, right? The more society has progressed, the more clothing we've been wearing, and she just might feel more comfortable wearing explicit type clothing like she does in Injustice 2. And even still, it's not very revealing. Characters like Harley Quinn have always been explicit, and that's why you're able to do a more revealing loadout for Harley Quinn. Same thing can be said for Poison Ivy, even though most of her attire is just plant life anyway. Even Wonder Woman, to some extent, has some revealing clothing, which makes sense for the character. But a character like Black Canary, it just doesn't. So for that reason, the gear was obviously removed from the game. Because quite frankly, this look would be A, distracting because it doesn't make sense for the character, and B, just unnecessary. There are more examples of this happening inside of Injustice 2, gear being removed or certain characters being reshaped for the game, and in almost all of these circumstances, the answer isn't censorship. The answer is aesthetic style, or adjusting their gear so that it makes sense for the particular character you're designing it for. A character like Atrocitus probably wouldn't have had a lot of customization options if you gave him his original design, so they changed it around so that they could give him more customization options. And the changes that we see here are just kind of the same thing, but around the other way. Instead of changing the core character to suit the gear, they changed the gear to suit the core character. Let me know what you think about the quote-unquote censorship in NetherRealm games, more specifically the Injustice games. It will be interesting to see how NetherRealm treats this type of content again in the future if they decide to use the gear system, which I believe they will, and I do think they'll get a little bit more explicit with it in Mortal Kombat, because that's more of an adult game than the Injustice games, but I can't imagine it getting much more explicit than, say, somebody like Starfire's gear or Harley Quinn's gear or something like that. Regardless, I'd love to hear opinions about this, because I think a lot of people have an immediate distaste when they hear words like censorship, which makes sense because in a lot of cases censorship is a bad thing, but if you still consider this censorship, I would consider it a very good thing because it keeps a lot of these characters core to who they are. Thank you so much for watching this video. My name has been Bilbsy, and I will see you in the next video.